Okay. Welcome to the Walter Bosley channel, and this is the first of a new way I'm going to be doing the interviews, and I think this way is going to work out fantastic. And so we're kicking that off with Joshua Cutchin, who I've been acquainted with for some years now, and Joshua has really, in my opinion, really marked his place in our field, in our genre. With he's written several other books, but this book, and I want to get the title right. Here it is, right here. Ecology of Souls: A New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal, volumes 1 and 2. And folks, this is one of those, in my opinion, that is a must-have in your library if you're interested in any of those topics that we're all interested in our community: the paranormal, UFOs, you name it. And this is really an astounding work that, in my opinion, is, a lot of people try to be the new John Keel, the new Jacques Vallée, and most of them fail. Joshua, with this book, you have reached that status, in my opinion. Seriously, you are in that company with this work.
I appreciate it. I really appreciate it, Walter. A lot of thought, I will say that. It kind of, in a lot of ways, was just getting all the stuff off my chest that I've been noticing over the years. And if that's where it lands, then that's where it lands. But I primarily did it for myself more than anything else. And I think maybe that might be the key. I don't know.
I think that's definitely one of the keys, because you're true to those things that drew you to these topics. You wrote it for yourself, essentially, primarily. And I think that's where very often, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, any kind of writing, very often we hear when someone achieves a great work, a very good, solid, great work. That's where it comes from. Is they're writing that book that really is coming from the heart and the soul, and which has been fed by the knowledge. Your previous books on the fairy lore, on the cryptid things. But what you do that I think makes it so special is, in our community, there are certain predispositions that this is this, that is that. And for a lot of people, still, things don't overlap. They don't want them to overlap. And as you know, and I know, and some others know, in the reality of the reports and the things going on, this stuff overlaps. This stuff overlaps big time.
Oh boy, it does. I mean, I'm very fond of saying that if it's not a complete circle, it's definitely a Venn diagram with significant overlap. You can only hear things about missing time. I mean, buzzing sounds just come across all these different contact modalities, even some cryptid reports. Mm-hmm. And of course, the lights. I mean, I think an argument could be made that the most cross-paranormal phenomenon that links a lot of these different things is the anomalous lights, and what we assign to those is almost always context dependent. You know what I mean? If you see them above a Neolithic stone circle, they're fairies, and if you see them in a haunted house, they're ghosts, and if you see them in the sky, it's UFO. So I think if people could sort of strip away a lot of that context and look at the core of these phenomena, they might see that there definitely seems to be some connective tissue. And I don't know if it's similar things using similar methods, or different things using similar methods, or it's all one big thing. Obviously, I'm inclined to the all one big thing because I just wrote Ecology. But I think that's something that's worth considering and worth entertaining, at least as a thought experiment or a mental exercise.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a necessity to consider the possibility of it being all one thing. I'm a great believer in, probably because it's one of my strengths, in pulling back and looking at the big picture, and because then you can better see where things connect and overlap.
Well, and my thing is 70 years of looking at this as its own little thing hasn't really gotten us a heck of a lot closer to truths, So why not just stir it up a bit, just to, at the very least, if this is a completely dead end, it can sort of maybe lead you down a different tangent that might hold the key to unlocking this stuff. Who knows?
Well, what makes this work, when I first heard about it a while back, what really intrigued the heck out of me, that drew me to it, is the whole the dead. What I first heard about it was its connection to the discussion of UFOs and the dead. And that was something that I'd heard was out there. I think I heard you on another interview a couple years ago mention this. One of the first times I heard that this was a thing out there being discussed. And of course, we go back to Ann Strieber's, observation that, she thinks this has something to do with what we call death. And that just, because of my experiences and my research, that intrigued, no pun intended, the hell out of me. So let me kick off with a question, just to kind of set a tone. Do you see the dead as actual conscious intelligences that are out there, that are real? Do you yourself see that way?
Personally, I do. I think that there's a lot of room for discussion. There are a lot of different theories on what happens after we die and what ghosts are. Ghosts might not be the spirits of people. They might be recordings on stone tapes, as was once thought, or maybe that's just the superficial ego part of us, and another part of us leaves to depart and become reincarnated, or any number of things. I had a mandate that I set for myself when I started writing this book, where I told myself that I wasn't going to try to reinvent the wheel when it came to concepts of the afterlife and the dead. I honestly, as far as ghosts are concerned, I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that there might be some sort of time slip going on in some of these cases. And that's where a lot of these older sightings of people from space are just us with our little tiny devices that we hold in our hands and stuff like that. But I have a great deal of sentimentality for the idea that the dead are out there and do continue in some form or fashion to have a degree of ego recognition. I suspect, and you'll see this sort of in the work that Anne posthumously authored, strange phrase, but Anne posthumously authored with Whitley Strieber, this idea that even though when you pass on you are stripped of ego, you still have access to that. And the relationships that you build here on Earth are still worthwhile. Just because your ego and your superficial personality is stripped away, it doesn't mean that those connections didn't mean anything. It's an interesting take, which I find quite comforting. But I do think that there is something about the process of transition that probably does strip you of all the things that you once thought were superficial. I mean, you certainly see that in a lot of these states that mirror the near-death experience. Obviously, near-death experiences themselves, but also some UFO contact experiences and psychedelic experiences for sure. That was a circuitous answer.
Hey, that's the way you're speaking my language, because I do the circuitous thing all the time and have to remind myself to come back and succinctly restate things. So I get you.
Fair enough.
One thing that along the lines of what you were just saying about the dead and access that identity, my perspective is that a lot of people, it's very popular today. There's a lot of people out there that accept, believe, assume that progress in the human experience, progress is to be absorbed into a collective. That, okay, and I do think we are connected in certain ways, but the assumption is that, to strip all of our ego and become, absorbed into the one. And that has never seemed legit to me. And of course, the people that believe that, the collectivists, will say, "Well, that's because it's your ego speaking." I'm like, no, it's wrong. It's just not right for another reason. And in my conversation, I've had several conversations, or a few conversations on this with Joseph Farrell, private conversations, and he and I have discussed, the perspective that no, the desired objective is to grow into individuation. It's individuation. It's leaving the collective and the great experience of and responsibility of becoming, just individuated, becoming an individual who still can experience sympathy, empathy, and such with other beings. That's the real challenge. It's easy to be absorbed into a collective Borg. It is more difficult to achieve the virtues. And I think that therein is where you find what you alluded to with that in this life, you're Joshua Cutchin, I'm Walter Bosley, and we have, this identity, these names in this life, but maybe who we really are is that individuated spirit being, what have you, that many would call a soul, and that's who we really are. Each person, really is that soul, but it is an individual, intelligent being, entity, which experiences the human experience in many different lives.
Yeah, I resonate with a lot of that. I think the trick of threading the needle is to acknowledge a spiritual unification, which I am quite sympathetic to. Something bordering on an animist perspective, even though animism has fallen out of popular use. Something bordering on an animist perspective, while still acknowledging the value and, quite frankly, the diversity of having a bunch of individual perspectives. I mean, there are certain things that I don't want to do that other people excel at. I mean, I have a brother-in-law who is an engineer, which I just don't have a mind for. But without him, the people like him, society would fall apart, right?
Right.
So I think that's the needle to thread. At the same time, I do think that there is an underlying, I suspect, I should say, an underlying bedrock of just something resembling soul energy, and we are just sort of concrescences upon that. I mean, the example that I always like to use, because people like to push back against reincarnation, that's the old joke of like, well, it seems like 1,000 people were all reincarnated as Cleopatra. How can that possibly be true, right?
Right.
And it falls short with this one-to-one comparison of what lives are and what might happen on the other side. And what I suspect, or at least the way that I make this work in my own thinking, is that we do indeed have these unique identities, but they might be comprised of a lot of different things. I mean, the other example is, if reincarnation is a thing, why are there more people on Earth than ever? And my response is always, well, how many waves can be on the ocean? I think it's theoretically a limitless amount.
I like that.
Well, I mean, it also speaks to this other thing, which I think the water cycle is quite a useful metaphor. And if you look at a lot of spiritual hymns and metaphors and analogies and things like that, you'll see this return to this idea of water cycles, rivers going to the sea, and things like that. And I suspect that we die, and we were once this unique raindrop, but once we enter that ocean, we mix with a lot of other things. And someday we congeal again into a raindrop, but the molecules within that raindrop might have watered continents all over the world.
Right.
It's comprised of many different things. So in that sense, then yeah, there could be 1,000 people who have parts of Cleopatra in them. If that's
sure. And whatever that nebula is, wherever it is, whatever it is, that is for simplicity's sake, we'll call it where we come from. That's what we return to from this individual, particular lives. Keeping the reincarnation, context. So now that I've brought it cosmic, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, so the genesis of this project was born out of, probably 7 or 8 years of just observations. And, once you get that stuck in your head about the UFO alien abduction experience having something to do with death, you start to look for that and see little things here and there. So I kind of kept track of those. But I have this philosophy in my own work where if there's something I don't like, I really want to lean into it. Push where there's mush, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And I try to do that, in my spiritual life and my political life. Like, let's test these values and see if there's actually something to them.
Sure.
And, one of the things that I could never really reconcile, that always kind of made my toes curl a little bit in the bad way, were these stories of pre-birth memories in alien abductions. And that's just like, that's the corner of the UFO conference vendor room that I normally don't go to. You know what I mean? But at the same time, these stories don't go away. And, I think that speaks to this reincarnative element that we're sort of alluding to as well. And it's something that my editor, Barbara Fisher, said at one point. She's like, Josh, it really isn't about death. It's about the cycle of life and reincarnation. I said, yeah, I know. I said, but death is the gateway to understanding that.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure psychopomps are gonna come up, but that alludes to the psychopomp Hecate, the goddess of the underworld. Mm-hmm. She's there to greet you when you die, when you enter in there. On that, I wanted to, because you hit right on something, a quote. From, and this of course is from a book edited by an author that I know is one of your favorites because he's one of mine, and that is it's from the Tibetan book The Great Liberation, edited by Evans Wentz, and from Carl Jung's I believe it's either Evans Wentz. Ooh, wait a minute. Is it from
I can probably tell you if you just read the quote. I can probably tell
I'm going to read it. Yeah. Okay. For some reason, I was thinking it was Jung, but basically,
reading of synchronicity.
It has to do with that thing of really polarizing the concepts of life and death. The life is good, death is bad thing. Where the quote is really. Life and death, our understanding, our grasp, our experiences of them are modifications of consciousness. In other words, going into being born, emerging from life, and dying. This is the way I interpreted this. These are really not the stark landmark experiences so much as you're just modifying your consciousness. Okay, now I'm going to be alive, or now I'm alive. Oh, now I'm passing through to that other state where I'm dead. Was that Jung or Evans Wentz?
I feel like that's Evans Wentz, but
that's I think you're right. I think I misreferenced the quote there, but that's to me what you were saying is
absolutely, yeah. I think
and what Barbara Fisher said, yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a very similar thing. It's just adjusting. We're just adjusting our consciousness.
Right. To a lesser degree, and Jeffrey Kripal has talked about this, how sex doesn't exist without death and vice versa. And it should be, understood that way. And once you sort of get that in your head, and you look at the preoccupation that so many of these phenomena have with our reproduction, they
the French
kill us.
I believe
Yep.
Exactly. The French and the orgasm, la petite mort, the little death.
So these entities either want to kill us or reproduce with us, right? Yeah, that's it. And then you take a look at some of the things that Terence McKenna, Saint Terry of McKenna, on the front cover of Volume 1. Some of the things that Terence McKenna said about the times when consciousness is truly in these betwixt and between states is orgasm and death and the psychedelic experience, which you could extend to the dream experience as well. And then you get these other curious little details. Sorry, one last thing. You hear these stories that make me wonder if we're not looking at a revolving door. There are numerous allusions in the literature of Western Europe where fairies will cry and laugh at funerals, and the implication there to me means that they've lost something on the other side that's now coming into this other phase, or they're gaining something in the case of the death.
Or we become the fairies when we pass into death.
And that's sort of another inspiration point for this, because obviously I have a lot of respect for Jacques Vallée in general, and I mean, so much of what I do and have done is just a riff on Passport to Magonia. But this is sort of something that was left on the table when Passport to Magonia came out. And the question is, what does a 14th century version of Passport to Magonia look like? So in 69, Valet is saying, hey, this UFO contact experience stuff looks a lot like this fairy mythology. Well, if that had happened, that conversation had happened 500 years earlier, it would have said, hey, these fairies look a lot like the dead. That's just what a lot of these cultures, especially prior to the rise of theosophy, thought about fairies in that context. So
there's
using the transitive property, where does that bring us,
Yes, yeah. There's a quote in your book. You quote Catherine Briggs, and I found this to be really interesting. In fact, no, I don't have it handy. It's the one about the no right to be dead at all, or the. I'm not quoting it right, but I think you know the quote.
I do know the quote. I might even be able to bring it up here if I cheat. So Catherine Briggs was a seminal fairy scholar, and someone whom we owe a lot of our fairy knowledge in terms of bringing it from the older folklore into actual recorded texts. And she wrote, I cannot find it. I've got my PDF open. Oh yeah, here we go.
I know, I do.
Yeah, I like to cheat, and I have it up above this other screen, so I look really thoughtful when I do it. But she never really shied away from this. And the quote that you're referencing is, "It is arguable, of course, that in primitive times all the dead were fairies, and that Christianity has removed most of them out of the fairy power. But on the whole, one might say that those of the dead who inhabit fairyland are people who have no right to be dead at all." And again, if you look at, nobody really knows what the fairies were. That's the difficult thing. There's some evidence to suggest that the conflation between fairies and the dead might have been part of Christian influence, although you find this connection between little subterranean people fond of kidnapping and the dead throughout the world. And of course, with some of this New World folklore, there's always the question of cultural contamination of the early ethnographers. But you also find, it's just so widespread, it really suggests to me that there is some degree of objectivity in the way that these things are being described.
And of course, when you talk about, to me, when you talk about the fairies linking to the dead, again, going back to Hecate, I suspect, in my own research I've come to this, I suspect that Hecate is actually among the, first of all, I have to say my view of the Tuatha Dé Danann is not the popular anthropological conclusion. I do not see them as merely tribes who came from another part of the world, unknown part of the world at that time, who just invaded Ireland in ships. I take the original lore a little more at face value than that, and I mean, because it says they came out of the sky. It just, to me, the anthropological assumption doesn't fit. So I see the Tuatha as intelligence, as beings from some other place, be it another dimension. It could be another planet, but also I see the chthonic gods and goddesses, specifically Hecate, as possibly one of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And if that's the case, there you have the Tuatha connected to the land of the dead by virtue of Hecate. So,
to your point, I'm always looking for ways to have my cake and eat it too. And these powers coming from the sky and reconciling that with a force of invasions. I mean, that doesn't mean that there wasn't some sort of possessing force. And I know that sounds awfully, awfully pulp horror, like they were possessed by these spirits. But I suspect that there's a lot more. I suspect that there's a lot more interplay between us and these invisible hands than we fully acknowledge. And of course, the Hecate aspect of that would also play into that. I mean, this was once a lived reality for people. that there were these forces that would act through you and that would guide you. And you know, to this day, I tried to excise as much of it as I could from the books, and I've had people say that it doesn't come through, which makes me happy because I'm trying to be objective with it. But I am a practicing Christian, and it's amazing to me how much we have lost a real richness of understanding of just sort of the nuance and diversity of actors in the spirit world that we lost when we sort of adopted this monotheistic approach to everything. You know, I mean, that's part of the reason that I gravitated towards the name Ecology of Souls for the book, is because it implies a vast spectrum of beings that are not good nor are they bad. They're just free agents. You know, the analogy that I like to use is, a shark isn't evil, but its interests do not align with yours if you're in the ocean.
Very good. That is a great way to put it. Well, you know, then that brings to mind, you know, the thematic, I guess you'd say, connection between, for example, the Tuatha Dé Danann and figures like the Quetzalcoatl's and the Viracochas and stuff. These people, beings, whatever they are, that came to the world, and from one perspective, they brought up a civilization, but one could argue from a purely biblical perspective that these were the fallen angels that taught mankind all these naughty things they weren't supposed to know, like warfare and stuff. And it's almost like, depending upon where you were on the side of a conflict, is how you'll perceive these beings, right?
History is written by the victors, right? I mean,
that's right.
I mean, that idea of the civilizing trickster is so persistent throughout different mythologies, from Prometheus to obviously the serpent to Maui. It suggests that, at the very least, that particular mythological trope arose at such a time depth that we literally don't have words to describe the people who, quote unquote, invented it. But at the same time, it does suggest this sort of level of interaction that we have forgotten. And it sounds so trite unless you've experienced it. But there's that sort of Jungian idea that people don't have ideas have people. And it sounds like sniffing your own farts until it happens to you, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to fiction authors, and I'm working on a project myself, and I've experienced this a little bit, where they'll say, my characters won't let me do things. Like, I'll try to write them into a scenario that is not where they would be or what they would want to do, and they just literally, the character will not let me do this. And that doesn't sound like the way that imagination and making things up should go, you know?
Doesn't sound like it, but I've experienced firsthand that thing where you get far enough. There's that certain threshold. It's different with each work, but you cross that threshold where, as they say, the book starts writing itself. If that makes any sense. So I know exactly that phenomena. I've experienced it.
Yeah, and so, like I said, like, you know, somebody like, I'm not bagging on him, but my brother-in-law, the engineer, he probably hears something like ideas have people, and he's like, what the hell are you talking about, Josh? But if you're involved in these creative aspects, it does feel like almost like you're spirit ridden or something. I mean, I don't want to ascribe too much importance to Ecology of Souls, but I will say at the same time that it came together shockingly quickly. I mean, I wrote the whole thing in about 9 months. With 6 months of research prior to that, and
that's astounding.
I don't know how that happened. You know what I mean?
That's an accomplishment. You were tapped into that stream. That
it kind of feels that way. Yeah, feels that
exactly. Way. Because I mean, really, that's an astonishing work to, you know, what you just said. The time that you. So I would say that, but I disagree with you. I do put importance on the work, as I said earlier, because it really is, I think, one of the essential works that people interested in any of these things individually or the unified perspective really needs to read. It's an essential book, because what you're talking about in here, it's for many, it's going to be a completely new way to look at things. where these specific topics, UFOs being a very popular one, are concerned.
Well, I'm very flattered by that, especially with someone who has read as broadly and as deeply as yourself on these topics. So that means quite a bit. I suppose in like a perfect world, I would love as a lasting contribution this to be considered alongside things like cryptoterrestrials and ultraterrestrials and extraterrestrials. Let's throw in, for lack of a better term, the ecology of souls hypothesis, and sort of explore that alongside these other things that have gained quite a bit of traction. So who knows, maybe at some point people will look at that, because, for anybody who hasn't checked out the books, I just wanted to write the UFO book. You alluded to the UFO connection being the most compelling part. That's all I wanted to do, Walter. But,
the rabbit hole.
Yeah, they, whatever they are, had different plans for me. And it became very apparent. Well, it became very apparent that if I just wanted to write the UFO book, it would have to devolve into endless digressions with everything.
Sure.
I'd mentioned the fact that we have multiple souls, and people would be like, "What the heck does that mean?" So, the first book really tackles a lot of these older soul concepts that, again, we were once very much in touch with, and I there are a couple. This more than any of my other books makes me wish that I hadn't used the word universal so often in earlier books, because the stuff that we talk about, especially in volume 1, when I use the term universal, I mean, there really are universal ideas. This idea of polypsychism, that we have multiple souls within us, the idea of the wandering soul, that the soul can go abroad at will, especially during times of trance or sleep or illness. And the idea, like something as specific as the idea that the soul can be imagined or conceptualized as a bird. Like, it is literally universal. Like, every culture, or I should be a little more specific. Every region had at least one culture. Every region that we've inhabited on Earth has at least one culture that has conceptualized the soul as a bird. And it does. That was the justification for spending so much time talking about all these other ideas before I got to the juicy bits of the UFOs.
Yeah, the one. Well, that's a good point for me to ask this question, and let you, run with this this particular topic. Where did you stand on UFOs before you wrote the book, and then how did the writing of this book change that?
Well, if it wasn't for alternatives to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, I would have never been interested in UFOs. A little funny backstory. I, until an embarrassingly late age, probably quite frankly, my mid-20s, I was terrified of alien abductions. Even though at the same time, I said to myself, you look at this UFO literature, which I had a passing familiarity with, and I'm like, well, they'd have us believe that there are dozens of different species visiting us in thousands of differently shaped craft. And that was just multiplying variables too unnecessarily for me. So I said, well, there aren't any aliens. But I'd still, in the darkness of night, like, freak out. Like, I remember one time my flip phone had a low battery and it kept beeping in the middle of the night in my bedroom. And I was like, they're here for me. Sort of going down a paranoiac route. But
sure.
Once I discovered the, I would argue at this point, objectively true aspect of the phenomenon that does involve human consciousness, that did two things for me simultaneously. And what it did was it not only opened me up to the reality of the phenomenon, because now these things can be anything they damn well please, right? But it also suggested that were I to ever find myself in that scenario, I would have a foot in the door towards a degree of sovereignty over whether or not I let it happen, right? So that really blew it apart for me. And then, of course, I dove into the between aliens and fairies. So for a while, I was on like this sort of train of like, well, maybe they're nature spirits and the UFOs, because the UFO fairy thing, especially when you compare it to the Western European stuff, is just such a close match. And again, Passport to Magonia, I would not be here without it. But there was a lot of stuff that's left on the table, and I've kept finding stuff. And there was a time when I would hedge my bets and say, it's a pretty close match, but is it exact? And now I'm like, no, it's pretty much an exact match. I'm confident enough that I can find something in fairy folklore that I can find in the UFO literature, or something in the UFO literature that I can find in the fairy folklore at this point. So I was on that train for a while, and quite honestly, I don't really like the idea that it's all dead people or something that it has to do with the afterlife. I mean, it's an uncomfortable proposition. Because we like to think that we have a grip on what happens to us, even if we aren't religious practitioners. We like to have some sort of headcanon that we work on.
Right.
Yeah. And this throws the whole thing up in the air, and it's kind of a strange way to look at it. The other thing that's really changed over the course of the Ecology of Souls specifically is the idea that these phenomena are to some degree self-generated, which is something that I was very, very hesitant to even entertain, because the inner 12-year-old in all of us wants there to be some sort of external objective entity at work. But once you start looking at things like, people in earlier civilizations did acknowledge the fact that you could see your own soul and things like that, then it starts to look like, well, maybe these things that seem to have such an intimate knowledge of us and that seem so attached to our well-being in a lot of cases, maybe they are some sort of projection that's coming from the witness. And that's something that I just don't like, but it's there. There's a case to be.
Looks like we have a little bit of a freeze up. Oh, okay.
Oh, no,
statement.
No, I just said that I really don't want that to be the case, but if you look at all the stuff that I collected in Ecology of Souls, the case can be made that is coming from within us, and I don't know exactly how that works, a psychic projection or something, but there's a case that can be made for sure.
Well, and there's the suggestion in one of the chapters that I was looking at is that the UFO experience within this context could be the thing that helps us deal with, we do this thing called dying, and maybe that's what the experience is preparing us for, getting us more comfortable with it.
Yeah, that sort of goes a little bit into this idea where, some people have decided that they've explained quote unquote near-death experiences by saying that it's an endogenous dump of DMT. It sort of seems a little bit like that, almost like it's a psychological mechanism to help us come to grips with that. But, what I love about the near-death experience stuff, I've often said that there are only two hills in the paranormal that I will die upon. And one is the existence, no matter how slight, of psi phenomena. I mean, the work of Dean Radin, Daryl Bim, Rupert Sheldrake, I think, is just top-notch stuff that does not get as much respect as it deserves from the wider scientific community. So that's one hill. And the other hill is the veridical nature of the near-death experience. I mean, you have people obtaining information that they would have no other way. You have people who learn about their actual lineage. They grow up adopted, and they come back from a near-death experience and they describe their biological mother and father to a T. So it suggests that there's some degree of objectivity there. Now, you can sort of do some mental gymnastics and say maybe there's retrocausality involved or some sort of time slip or something along those lines. For example, if someone has a near-death experience and they see themselves in the hospital, they remember seeing themselves in the hospital because they were told later that they saw themselves in the hospital. Retrocausality in time sort of make my head explode. Yeah. I didn't talk about time in this. That was a notable omission because the book's long enough. But there is a strength to the near-death experience data that I think is something that we should come to grips with. I mean, I'm all for starting to use the phrase near-death experience deniers instead of skeptics at this point, because there's just such a massive material.
Yeah. When you mention we're talking about learning things about your own DNA in the near-death experience, it reminds me that the whole seeming obsession that the ETs have with the reproduction experience, that how that could possibly be them trying to reveal something to us. For example, that perhaps we do, let's say literally, reincarnate within our own bloodlines. So therefore, it's focusing on the reproductive context to try and reveal that to us. It's you will, and not just a descendant thing, a bloodline thing, but you literally yourself, what you are and who you are, your own individual identity will reappear down the line in the bloodline. You will be your own great grandson or granddaughter.
You will embody you'll embody the grandfather paradox. But yeah, I'm my own grandpa.
Yeah, I'm my own grandpa. Yeah, that thing. And I've thought about that, and I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. And what little investigations I've done into it actually reveal some rather, I don't want to say disturbing and uncomfortable, but within the common social context, people would call it disturbing and uncomfortable.
Upending, I think, probably would be a good word for it.
Yeah. So after you finish the book, and particularly the sections where you do talk about the UFO experiences, with the dead and such, is it much different now than where you were before on what you think UFO experiences are?
Yes, but at the same time, I've noticed something that kind of bothers me a little bit after I finish this. As I'm sure you're aware, among my mentors in this field, Greg Bishop, and Greg has been such a guy in a lot of ways. And one thing that he's always sort of banged into my head is that is to avoid the certainty fetish, wherever it may arise.
I agree.
But also at the same time, he's someone who is very open to the idea that unless you're reevaluating your positions, your mind is probably beginning to calcify, and maybe becoming brittle. I love this hypothesis. It explains so many things that I just didn't know what to do with. UFOs that turn into birds. We alluded to the bird soul earlier. That's a nice way to explain some of these high strangeness aspects. Sure. And there are other examples that I could provide. But anyway, I just kept on finding things that reinforce this. And it felt like getting high on your own supply. So that really concerns me. At the same time, I also noticed the fact that I could walk away from all this after writing this. I feel like I've kind of said my piece, and I don't really know what I would. I have some projects in the works, right? So I'm not stepping away, but I could be happy going. You've perhaps reached a particular level of understanding that it's maybe not so much a mystery. I've solved it for myself. Yes, that's the way. And I'm not telling other people that this is right. Right. I'm not telling them that it's objective. I'm saying that for me, this works. And it has a predictive capacity to incorporate some of the stranger outliers. And when you see that, it starts to feel like your destination, So sure. I still have some other ideas that I'd like to interrogate, and I'm going to try to force myself into alternate interpretations just to see, because I think that's a healthy thing to do. But yeah, so it has fundamentally changed the way that I view the UFO problem, and at the same time, it's scooped up a lot of the bits and bobs that I really didn't have a place for, and that I think is just I have not found anything. And again, toot my own horn. I have not found another hypothesis that does that for me. Right. And you know what, Walter? There's 2 books, but there's kind of a third book. If you reread the whole thing again with this in mind, a lot of this, even though I just alluded earlier to excising as much of my own faith as I could from it, a lot of this is an exercise in me trying to reconcile this with my own spiritual path. And I've had people come to me since this has been out and said, who haven't read the book, and they say, well, I hear that you're a practicing Christian. How do you reconcile all this? And my kind of pithy, self-serving response is, well, read the afterword in volume 2, because I can't I can't more succinctly sum up how I feel and how this interfaces with my own faith than I do there. And that's when I let it all hang out and say, okay, this is how I'm trying to reconcile all of this.
There's an aspect, I think, of any religion, but within the context of the Judeo-Christian, in Christianity, not enough people realize that they're confusing, to borrow a phrase from my friend Joseph Farrell, they often confuse churchianity with what Christianity actually is when you do that personal, close look. And they are two different things, and I think they're applying their grasp of the churchianity filter when they will ask a question like, how do you reconcile that? And it's because, I would venture to say, it's because, well, maybe they don't have a real grasp on what you mean when you say, a practicing Christian. They're just looking at it from the trappings they're familiar with.
It's I think that's an excellent point, and I can't emphasize this enough. And I kind of love it, and people don't pay enough attention to it. Judaism and Christianity are pretty darn weird. If you go back far enough, they scratch all your strange itches that you might have if you're into this stuff. A book that really opened my eyes, and forgive me, I was just typing to make sure I get this correct, is a book called Tree of Souls, The Mythology of Judaism by Howard Schwartz. And you read some of the stuff in there, which is obviously part of the legacy and the continuum of Christianity as well. And it sounds, I wouldn't say it sounds like Hubbard, but it kind of gets a little Hubbardish, you know what I mean? Just these ideas that are so foreign to us. And there's a richness there that I think in the modern evangelical tradition has been completely lost. And, a strangeness and that sort of numinous quality that I find myself as a Christian craving. The issue that again a lot of people don't know because they don't know the history is I think the reluctance that you find in the evangelical tradition that you're referring to, remember, is they have an ancestry connected to the Puritans. And right.
As we know, the Puritans were all about everything but what we do is evil, and they basically, if they in their ways finally pissed off people over in England, so they had to come over here to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and all the other colonies said, "Oh heck no, you don't bring that superstitious nonsense to our colonies," and that when they faded away. Really what it was is a great strain of American Protestantism really was born out of the Puritans, and with that comes the superstitions and the no, it must be this, and the strict don't look over there, don't play with the Ouija board.
Even the phrase superstitions implies a richness that I think was lacking there. I mean, it's more like prohibitions or because there's a reductivism, which is what I've sort of pushed back with in the Ecology of Souls title that I mentioned earlier. It's if it's not an angel or Christ or I guess the Puritans wouldn't have given much time for saints, I guess. But if it's not one of those things, then it's a demon, And,
the great irony as we say that is Cotton Mather, one of the big Puritans.
Right.
I mean, this guy was an expert occultist, right? I mean, as far as being a scholar, he knew all about demonology, and he was fascinated with it. The
witch's hammer,
fruit, yeah. So that's kind of funny.
But I guess what I'm sorry, just to sum up sort of the past couple of little threads that we had, I think there's a way where you can take a 10,000-foot view and you can see that a lot of these spiritual paths are describing very similar things, and I think that's some of the things that are most important to latch onto. And I appreciate the amount of nuance that a lot of indigenous spiritualities can shed on Fortean topics. My favorite I have two favorite pieces of paranormal media, and they are two shows from FX. One is the second season of Fargo. It's my favorite depiction of UFOs ever put to film. But the other one that I found quite charming is Reservation Dogs, about the youths on I believe it's a Muskogee reservation in Oklahoma, and it's this wonderful take on how things that we would consider supernatural or high strangeness are just embedded into everyday life. And you do get a Bigfoot episode, and guess what? It's tied to the dead. And you do get a UFO appearing in an episode, and guess what? It's tied to the dead. And I think that there was a richness there that our modern Christianity, coupled with the materialism of the 21st century, that we're craving for something to fill that space right now.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I think that's where, what we call the ET religion comes from. This obsession in UFO land where it's got to be ET or nothing at all. And here's the irony about what we're talking about is, in spite of the things we're talking about here, it's also true, in my opinion, that there are intelligent beings out there on other planets, and they are coming here.
Absolutely. And, I suspect that I alienate, pardon the pun, more people than I should, because they do think that, or they get the sense that I'm saying that there isn't life elsewhere in the universe. And to the contrary, I think it's almost a certainty. But the question is intelligent life that's visiting here. And I think that it's been a bit of a distraction for us as a human race. Because we have this idea that something reachable, something within even, we talk about Mars, we talk about something within reach is going to be hospitable, and it ain't. It just ain't. And I don't think we're really going to be going anywhere. And I think that carrot on the end of that stick is kind of distracting us from a lot of the problems that we have here.
Right. Going back to, again, in the UFO experience, going back to discussions with our friend Greg Bishop, I remember some years back, he was the first one that I heard about the concept of a UFO not allowing itself to be recorded. For example, I can say that in my own UFO experience, I was looking at this thing. I know how close it was to my house. I remember clearly exactly what I was seeing in vivid detail. And the whole time I had a camera, and I'm telling you, what's on that camera is nowhere near in the detail of what my eyes were seeing. And on top of that, there was another person with me seeing the same thing. So you got two minds seeing the same thing, but maybe it's not what's there.
You see, Walter, the craft has a projection beam that interferes with the chips in your camera, and let us continue to gild the lily. Or this phenomena is meta positioned somehow, and it is in complete control of things. I made this observation. I can get away with it less now that they're getting ready to turn 4, but my twin boys, at the time that I made this observation, if I didn't want them to have something, there was no way they were going to get it. And I could dangle it right in front of their face and, whip it away at the last minute, or maybe they get a little bit of a grasp and I'd pull it away. And I think that might be more akin to the relationship that we're seeing, that this is embedded into every facet of our reality. And honestly, it gets a little bit sticky here because I've talked to enough people who have had really negative experiences. So when you come in with the love and light stuff, it really makes them feel unheard. And I'm very much an advocate for hearing experiencers because, especially those who have had bad experiences, they're victims. And that's victim shaming is not something that we do in any other facet of our lives. So why do we do that for people in the paranormal? Because even if they're deluded, the trauma is real, right? So when you come at them with this sort of love and life stuff, this idea that, it's trying to push you on a path in your life, that's kind of a hard thing to hear. But again, if you adopt this idea that this intelligence might be operating with information that we just don't have at our disposal, then you can come up with all sorts of possible analogies that maybe give people a sense of peace. A kid at the pediatrician or an animal at the vet, a horrifying situation that is painful and uncomfortable and strange and alien, but is for their benefit. That's before you even get into the fact that some of this stuff is, I believe, demonstrably, unambiguously negative. But that's one way to sort of shift your perspective and use this sort of meta-positioned intelligence to explain some of those other experiences.
Well, when you're talking about the UFO subject and you do bring up, like you say, the data showing that there's a lot of negative involved with it, what you're up against today, for example, is the dogma in the ET crowd of what's called the so-called deathbed confession of Wernher von Braun that gets bandied about because of what von Braun said. Therefore, nothing extraterrestrial from space is any kind of threat. Where first of all, if he did really say these things,
I was going to say, what's the provenance on that? Yeah, I don't.
It's one person. We have one person claiming that, and they didn't go public with this until years after he was dead. But the problem is when you look at what he said even within his own context, I don't interpret it as he was saying that there's never going to be and there's no such thing as any threat from space. I see it as he was telling us how political entities were going to manipulate us using the threat of space. I like to put it this way. Terrorists are real. They're out there. They're a real danger. But telling us what we have to do to control our society or they'll get us, that's where the lies come in. And I think that's what he was actually doing. So these people don't want to hear that there's anything negative about ET.
It's sort of an early precursor to never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In a sense.
Exactly. That's what I think it is.
Well, and that's even before we get to the complicated issue of this phenomenon. If I'm going to use that as an umbrella term for the UFO stuff, this phenomenon not being singular, like it's just not.
Right.
It's a heaping helping of misidentifications, and then whatever that 20 to 30%, just spitballing here, whatever that 20 to 30% remaining is, might be misunderstood natural phenomena. It might be our own tech, which I know is something that you're sympathetic to.
Oh, yeah.
Breakaway civilizations and things like that.
Just hidden secret classified technology.
Yeah. Actual extraterrestrials, psi phenomena, and spirit phenomena, for lack of a better term. Even though that sounds awfully superstitious to a lot of people at
I like to put it, just because something's a UFO doesn't mean it's extraterrestrial. Just because the UFO is in the sky, a lot of people, it's really that simplistic for them. Insects will go in the sky, birds will go in the sky, flying squirrels will go in the sky, but those are each three distinctly different creatures.
Right. Yeah.
So just because something's in the sky doesn't mean, and within the UFO context, doesn't mean it's an ET, but for a lot of people, it really is. And they don't want to hear, like you say, about these other things. I want to shift gears and kind of move towards the subject of, as you talk about in this, and it's fascinating to me, a fascinating part of the book, the whole psychopomp and related things. And I'll start with, I've had a few really weird, I can't define them any other way than what we'd call paranormal, but experiences with owls in particular. And the one I had that reading your book instantly made me think of, I heard what I thought was the blood-curdling scream of a woman being attacked or being killed, and within an instant of that registering consciously in my mind, this was like around 9:30 at night, and I was thinking my neighbor behind me or something, as soon as that registered that, oh my God, there's a woman being attacked and murdered, suddenly then I heard the hooting come through, and I'm like, oh, wait. And then I heard it loudly, and I went outside, and the owl was perched atop the tree in my front yard. Big owl, just sitting there waiting for me. Again, I had time to run in and get my camera. And now this I have clearly, the owl. I can show them to you, these beautiful pictures of this owl. And here's the thing. This occurred within or about, it was within less than 7 days of an uncle of mine, one of my dad's brothers, passing away. And the uncle that it's family murkiness, but the one that within the murkiness, he has a closer connection than to his other two brothers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know exactly.
Yeah, so in a period of less than 7 days after that uncle passed, who, by the way, lived in Mineral Wells, West Virginia, back there in Mothman territory, but that's a side thing, I had this owl experience, and I can't help but interpret it as it was some type of message or herald from the dead.
I mean, I'm on the same page with you. I sort of alluded to this unspoken thing haunting the background of Passport to Magonia, the transitive property of the dead to fairies to aliens. And I think there's another one that sort of haunts the background of another work that's incredibly important to me, George P. Hansen's The Trickster and the Paranormal, which is a fantastic book. But he outlines the tricksterish nature of a lot of these phenomena, and at the same time doesn't take that extra leap of saying, well, who were some of these tricksters oftentimes? Oftentimes they were psychopomps. Hermes is obviously the best example of that. But these are characters who, like tricksters, are liminal. They dwell at the threshold of life and death. I mean, it doesn't get more liminal than that. Right. But once I started to go down that psychopomp rabbit hole, it was another one of those things that I sort of felt like was a revelation for me. To that extent, your encounter with the owl, a dear friend of mine, Mike Cleland, has written extensively about this connection. And, Mike settled on owls as messengers, but if you look at a lot of this ethnography from around the world, you'll find that owls are a psychopomp. Because psychopomps, maybe I should take a step back here and unpack that a little bit. Psychopomps are figures that lead us from life into death. They are not the same as death omens, although their presence might herald an impending death. You who are listening here at home know a lot of psychopomps, and you don't even realize it. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, they might be certain angels or God or Jesus themselves. But there are also more famous characters from other pantheons like Anubis, Hermes, even folk figures like the Grim Reaper. These are all examples of psychopomps. But that psychopomp umbrella also, in a lot of cultures, especially indigenous cultures, encompassed a lot of natural phenomena and animals. So things like the sun and the moon might serve that role because they are reborn each day and night, respectively, descending to the underworld and carrying the souls with them. But also animals. And the animals that you always see time and time and time again are horses, dogs, and birds, which happen to be three very important animals to every shamanic medicine man tradition that you find across the world. And as it just so happens, they're animals that are quite closely associated with the UFO phenomenon as well. People forget that the first livestock mutilation was Snippy the horse. Birds and UFOs, I alluded to these stories. I mean, Barbara has one. My editor, Barbara Fisher, has one where she saw a UFO and her mother saw a bird. And what do you do with that? But once you start to see the UFO and the entities perhaps within it, if they are separate at all, as a psychopomp, then that symbolism at least makes sense on some sort of level. And then, of course, dogs, you've got Big Bo from the Contactee era. And, I found some other stories here and there of dogs being seen in conjunction with these phenomena. But to a more specific point, and one that's I'm going to circle back around and encompass your owl story with a little bit, UFOs are vessels which take you to another realm. The UFO phenomenon and its scrutinization are completely obsessed with transportation. It's a transportation metaphor. Where are they from? Where are they going? How did they get here? Where are they taking us? And anything that is a transportation metaphor is a psychopomp symbol. And this is no more obvious than with the ferry over the River Styx, led by Karen.
Yeah.
But also, a lot of different cultures would conceptualize the afterlife or the other world. Those two terms are often interchangeable, as being over a mountain range or across the sea or, underground in some cases. But even in these psychopomp animals, you can see the themes of navigation and reaching far places are all embodied there, right? Horses can carry you places that you can't go. Birds can travel places that we can't. And dogs are, faithful companions that might lead you places. So once you start seeing the UFO as the psychopomp's boat or the ferry of the dead, which is an idea that Jung played with, actually. In his essay on flying saucers, he mentioned it in one sentence and didn't really dig into it any further. Then it further opens up a lot of these things. But there's a story that a friend of mine had that that very much resonates or resembles your owl story, which is why I just heard yours and I just couldn't help but smile. He had an uncle who passed away as well. And he went into the first time he visited his uncle's home, traveling from out of state to visit the house in preparation for the funeral and everything. He distinctly remembered a crow sitting outside, and he said that he felt that it was somehow connected to this death. Sure. And of course, corvids have a lot of death symbolism, but the bird is a psychopomp as well. But the crow was sitting at the prow of his uncle's boat that was parked in the yard. And I'm like, well, there you have it. Double trouble, double trouble. So, and that's what I love about the sort of Jungian approach to this stuff is it allows you to, it feels like, I don't know if it is, but it feels like you start to see the source code of reality a little bit or something.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's a really good way to put it. I think you're right on that. It's what I looked at it as, synchronicities to me are your glimpse into the fabric of reality. Because once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. You can't unsee them, and it changes you. And I think for me, it certainly did. It makes you, guess what? Among the ways it changes you, it begins to make you more comfortable with the idea that you are going to pass on. So again, it comes back to this monumental experience we have of this death thing.
Well, and that's perhaps another worthwhile thing to sort of introduce at this juncture. Making you comfortable with the idea of death. This is something that kept cropping up. And there's this phrase, I forget where I heard it first, but it's the idea of dying to death. And I perhaps heard it first in the context of these ancient mystery schools, that perhaps that was the entire driving force for organizing these events, right? Like the Eleusinian mysteries, the idea that you'd go underground, you'd have a horrifying experience, you'd come out, but you would know that there was something more to our reality than this life that we live. And by dying to death, in that sense, you're permitted to not only live the life that you have, ironically enough, but also to better yourself spiritually, better the lives of those around you. And once you start looking for that dying to death thing, I'll be damned if it doesn't just occur everywhere. I mean, people are using some substances like ketamine and psilocybin for terminal care because the patients come out of the other side of it not fearing their impending demise as much. In the Ray Hernandez Free study from the Edgar Mitchell Foundation, they determined that a lot of people who had experienced these different contact modalities, especially the UFO alien abduction experience or UFO contact, also walked away with the sense that they no longer feared death as much. You certainly see that. Certainly see that in the near-death experience. I mean, that's the biggest takeaway, right? Even when you have a bad NDE, which do exist, people go to hell. Yeah. There's still this sense like, oh well, at least there's something there that I can, sort of course correct on.
Yeah, and the negative experience is more, they come back, it's not that death scares them, it's they get concerned about, ooh, am I going to the wrong place? And what does that do? That makes them live that better life. So it's not so much death they fear when they come back, even from hell, it's, ooh, I don't want to go to that place when I do die, so I'm going to live differently.
And that's sort of, to that end, like I have to wonder if things like the Eleusinian mysteries, perhaps even the pyramids themselves, weren't something like near-death experience simulators. That the sarcophagi found in the pyramids, along with the curious resonations that you can get by producing certain frequencies in there, that might not slip you into an altered state of consciousness that allows you to perceive this fundamental truth.
Kind of lifts the veil.
Yeah. Sort of like doing it on the natch, as opposed to taking ayahuasca and vomiting your guts out. Yeah.
Well, what went to my mind while we were where we were just at was the rest of the story with the UFO we saw, the other individual and I saw over the houses, when it started moving, it started dumping this molten substance.
The slag that you hear, right?
The slag. And when I went to follow the trail of where the slag landed, what I found was this other substance that was like a very fluffy charcoal that when I tried to collect it, being the former agent and investigator type that I am, got to collect that evidence, put it back, it just disintegrated before I could do anything with it. Now, to take it further, within days of those spots, mushrooms sprouted where they had not grown before.
And what are mushrooms but an avatar for rebirth and decomposition and all those things?
And associated with the fairies.
Associated with the fairies and associated with, altered states of consciousness. So was this like classic angel hair, or?
To me it was charcoal
like that,
in color and I guess the experience of it, the texture of it and stuff, it just disintegrated into a powder where it couldn't be collected. I mean, it's singularly one of the three most weird experiences, of my life. And here's the thing. I had been that afternoon out at a site that I had discovered some years before. People on this channel have heard me talk about the mandala, this thing that's painted on the ground at a location I won't disclose publicly. I had been out there measuring every dimension of that for the first time. So I had been out there investigating it. I was in it. I was, on and around it. And then later that evening, this UFO appears. And the other witness, when he described the direction from which this thing was moving towards the house before it stopped over our house, was from that same cardinal general direction that you would go to, the specific, and then when it finally moved away, it moved toward, I'm in the middle of trying to figure this out, but I presented this in a talk at Contact in the Desert. It moved in the direction you would go to go to the Integratron. And the shape, the shape of the thing was identical to the dimensions of the domed top of the Integratron.
Oh man, I love it. I mean, there's so many ways we can take this. I mean, obviously, like the mandala thing, Jung would have been like, yeah, that makes sense, because that was so much of his essay was preoccupied with that symbol of totality. I love it whenever the contactees receive a little bit of validation, because their stories are so wacky and have been so derided. And I get it. I understand why. But whenever you get a glimpse into something so synchronous as that, it kind of implies that there's some legitimacy to them. I think it's interesting. I use this phrase. So there's this idea of... There's this idea that some early theologians were trying to find the earliest examples of human beings communing with the divine, and they were on the search for Prisca Theologia. And I, in my smartass sort of way, coined the term Prisca Ufologia, which is, what was the first way that people interface with UFOs? And pre-Kenneth Arnold and immediately post-Kenneth Arnold, it's all about death. It's all about death. So many of those early contactees were spiritualists and theosophists. So the point that I was trying to make with that is that the technology fetish that we see in the modern disclosure movement is really the outlier. It's really the new game in town. That's not the way we once thought of it. And arguably, I think that people have been seeing strange things in the skies probably since we first descended from the damn trees, but for millennia at least. And it was always thought of in those terms. And it was always thought of as being profound. And of course, that doesn't mean that's objectively what it is, but I think it certainly means that these alternative, dare I say, spiritual interpretations of the phenomenon deserve a little bit more respect than they get. And so the final thing that I'll say that your story put me in the mindset of was, physical debris, Walter. Ideas don't leave physical debris behind. And, ghosts don't do that either. And this is something that I always kept on butting heads with the cryptozoologists, who would say, like, well, Bigfoot can't be a ghost because ghosts don't leave footprints. And I'm like, have you read your parapsychology at all? Like, that was the first ghost hunting method, was to put talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to show up. Ghosts slam. So our reading of physical versus non-physical, I think, is in dire need of reevaluation. And I think that, quite honestly, some of the science is going to push us that way eventually. But this is sort of part of what I talked about in my essay for Robbie Graham's UFOs Reframing the Debate book. It behooves ufologists to at least try to incorporate something besides materialism if they're going to stay up to speed with the direction that things are going. And believe, as luck would have it, adopting a different perspective, maybe something like panpsychism or idealism, it incorporates a lot of these outliers much better than the current physicalist interpretation of reality does. I mean, even something like telepathy, which appears in so many encounters, even sightings of structured craft, there's oftentimes a telepathic component. That shouldn't exist in a materialist worldview. Not my opinion. Right. It's the opinion of people like Karl Popper and other science philosophers who have stated that. So you're already swimming in these murky pseudoscientific waters. Just go ahead and embrace the damn thing.
Well, I see the materialist ET, it's got to be ET obsession that unfortunately dominates the UFO topic these days. What that is a comforter that is protecting the person from seeing what's really there. That it helps them remain in denial of what this is really about.
Well, the example that I mentioned in the book, there are a couple of parts in book 2 that started out as Facebook posts and they found their way into the book. But the thing that I said, because people are like, well, if it's not ET, why is the government being so secretive? And I say, which upends your worldview more? That reality looks like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or that reality looks like the Iliad or the Odyssey? Like, which is weirder? Which has more of an impact on your day-to-day life? Yeah. I know the answer for me. I can conceptualize people from another planet building technology and coming here. I can wrestle with that. I can grasp that. There are profound existential implications to the latter possibility.
Yeah. Yeah, particularly when you're getting into, time and, just time and death. To me, they're right now where I'm at intellectually. To me, they are connected. I personally think that we are able to travel through time within our own personal timeline. You go from that. This is what I'm intellectually exploring. So that's why I say where I'm at is, upon our deaths, we can make a choice to go back and relive a portion of the life we just lived, or we can go forward. And I think there's a choice there. And that choice has to do with what Hecate actually represents. And that could serve to explain the weird, the idea that maybe the denizens of UFOs are us in the future coming back. That that's in there. Seeing dead loved ones. Well, are you seeing the dead, or are you looking back, or?
Right. No, I see exactly what you mean. Like if you're seeing dead loved ones in some examples, and in some examples you've got UFOs that are us in the future, they still sit at opposite ends of a lineage spectrum at which we sit at the center of the present. So it's our ancestors and our descendants on the other end. I wanted to play with that future race hypothesis, I guess is what you would call it, or something like that. But again, Michael Masters did such a good job. The book was so long, and the time thing too. Like time, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Time has something to do with this. I just can't write about it because my brain cannot handle it. I break real quick.
Well, that'll be the next stage in your own personal journey is understanding time stuff.
Yeah, personally, I think I need to do some work there if I'm to wrap my head around some of it. Yeah.
Well, it will when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Right.
That's true.
When you're ready, it's going to present itself, whether you like it or not. Right. Yeah. That's the way these things work, and that's what I love. And you talking about the dogs earlier. Whenever and this happens around my house more than once. In the 3:00 in the morning hour. we literally hear, the best way to put it is the baying of dogs. And the baying of dogs herald the arrival of you-know-who.
Yeah.
The queen of the night. Yeah, and I think of that. So
you're 100% right.
So anyway, well, hey, you know what? I think this is probably a good point to wrap up, because I am going to have Joshua back in the future, and what we'll probably do is just pick one little part or a chapter of this book, or how maybe it relates to some of his other works and stuff. But where can people get the book? Where can they find you?
You can find me at joshuacutchin.com. That's JOSHUACUTCHIN, like one cut on your chin, .com. And you can get the book from Amazon. And I have as many misgivings as anybody else does about Amazon. But if you've ever worked with their self-publication backend, it is quite robust and it's very easy to use. In fact, I just updated new layouts in Ecology of Souls, all three, and I'll get to why there's three in a moment, on the back end in December. And if I'd gone through a traditional publisher, it would have required a lot of work. I found 26 typos, which over the course of 260,000 words isn't bad, right? That's 1%.
That's not bad at all. That's good.
But some of them, a couple of them were egregious enough that I felt like they had to be addressed. So I said 3 volumes because Ecology of Souls turned out to be so large that I wasn't confident that any place's binding could handle it. And also, I knew people would be intimidated. So my solution for that was not only to split the book into 2 volumes, because the second book is roughly the UFO encrypted book, to be honest. But also to completely take the endnotes, bibliography, 3 appendices, and place them in a separate volume all their own. Now, to that extent, I think that if you buy the books, you have the right to see the sources, right? So that third piece, which I've called the Ecology of Souls Companion, is freely available on my website. For anyone to see. It's the exact same thing that you can pick up in the print version. I just have a print version because I'm a bibliophile and I want to have a physical copy of the references. So you can get it from Amazon. You can also get it by reaching out to me directly at my website. And when people buy 2 or all 3 together, I give them a discount that you can't get through Amazon. And I'll sign them too. So.
Oh, great. I got to tell you, as much as I have, been a critic as a publisher or author as far as Amazon goes, I'm an Amazon shopper. I'm on there all the time. I'm buying tons of books there. But you know what? On your testimony of your experience with them, I'm going to give them a look. As another look as far as getting stuff on Amazon. So I will. I'll check that out again. So anyway, I want to thank you for taking the time to be here, and I know that my subscribers are many of them are going to rush out to get your book because hearing you, they've heard me allude to it and mention it, and they probably heard it elsewhere, but to get to hear you talk a little bit about it, and like I said, I want to have you on again so we can talk about it again.
I think we covered like a 36th of what's in there.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's so rich, and this is why I'm saying it's. I think it's a must-have for anyone interested in these things, and us bibliophiles and researchers and scholars of this stuff, if we dare call ourselves that. This book really is. If you have Valet, if you have Keel, you got to have Cutchin. You got to have the Ecology of Souls. So again, thank you. I appreciate you being here.
Well, I appreciate it, Walter, and it's always such a joy to catch up with you.